we needed resources for our teachers. So going back to the professional development, one piece that was necessary was to go ahead and come up with some resources that teachers and students, parents, and administrators are able to access. And so that was really what the purpose of this website is. So this is our main district page. And you can see our mission and vision here on the front page. And then moving down to our model. We have really 5 core focus areas in the area of social emotional learning. We want to make sure we are focusing on adult social emotional learning. Also, of course, instructional practices are very important, and that can either be embedded practices, as I mentioned, throughout the day in different content areas, or it can be explicit instruction. And that's when you're actually teaching the vocabulary, teaching the skills that are needed for social emotional learning. We also wanted to make sure that we were operating from a trauma-informed lens, and we created a trauma leadership team this year, which is comprised of, we have members who are building administrators, who are school psychologists, school social workers, school counselors, and we really wanted to come together to figure out how can we provide our schools with resources they need to feel that they are comfortable working with trauma-impacted students. And so that was another big goal for us. I talked about student agency, so this is a heavy area of emphasis, and then our family and community partnerships. So this is an overview of our model here as we kind of figured out what are our big rocks and where do we want to focus. So you can see there's quite a lot of information on here. But our 5 big rocks are going to be these gray boxes. And really, we want to start with our purpose and our why. So we took a step back and said, what do we want? You know, what is driving us? What's our purpose? And so if we get back to our why, which I had mentioned earlier, that's really how we were able to come up with these 5 areas. Of course, with social emotional learning, the next 2 questions that come right after that are, how do we do this? And what do we do to actually make this happen? You know, these are great ideas, and we all want to have, you know, positive social emotional school-wide systems that help students grow, but what exactly does that look like? So we really broke this down into our how. School-wide systems has to do with adult building capacity, adult social emotional learning. And when I say that, I'm talking not only about building skills and offering professional development, but also providing resources for self-care. Because what we know is teaching is a profession that where you're giving yourself to another person. So it's really important that we take care of ourselves and we're able to, you know, to be whole as well. So that has to be an area of emphasis for us. And, you know, in addition, we need to walk the walk and exercise those social emotional learning skills with one another. So that's important to us. Another piece is having systems for supportive discipline. So this can look like restorative practices. It can look like positive interventions for shaping behavior, and so forth. And really, as long as we have these systems in place, we also want to provide our schools with the autonomy to be able to have these hows and whats, especially the whats, align with their own vision. So rather than saying, this is everything that we're doing for SEL, we want this to happen in every school, we want there to be some drivers that are data driven, but we also want the schools to have the flexibility to be able to implement those initiatives in a way that's going to be best for their community. So, you know, the last piece here is going to be building culture and, you know, making sure that we have those celebrations, whatever that might look like for the community, values that are driving what we do. And those are things that can vary from school to school. We want to make sure that that people have voice in this and feel empowered to be a part of developing that culture. So that would be the school-wide systems. Down here, we've got our SEL teaching practices. And at the beginning of the year, as I mentioned, we have our habits of the successful personalized learner. And we've shifted those now into our habits for agency, which I shared with you the 5 buckets there earlier. And what we want to do is make sure we are providing explicit instruction, but also providing opportunities for people to practice those skills, grow those skills, and really embedding SEL into academic content areas at all levels. And so again, there's going to be some differences in the school, how schools may interpret that. A lot of our schools, we do use as a district, a lot of cooperative learning, project-based learning, and opportunities for application are going to change from school to school. And so that would be, something, as long as we're providing those opportunities for students to practice SEL skills, that's really where the power and the growth comes. Then we, as I mentioned, we formed our trauma leadership team this year. And there are a number of components to being trauma informed. So we want to make sure we have those supportive climate and classroom practices. So we have developed a trauma-informed classroom checklist that teachers can use to kind of see where are my strengths and areas for growth in terms of how I want to be trauma-informed in my classroom, to really empower them to come up with some systems that, have predictable routines and procedures. That how are we building community in the classroom? Are we culturally responsive and considering equity as we are developing those systems in our classroom? And do we have systems in place that help students to learn how to regulate throughout the day? So again, if we're teaching a social emotional skill like emotional regulation, there's an opportunity to explicitly teach that skill, teach the vocabulary, teach what that might look like, teach I messages and so forth. But the power of it really comes when you have opportunities to really use those skills. And so, that's where you kind of get into that balance of embedded practice and explicit instruction.
So for instance, how are we going to achieve cultural responsiveness here? I love that the district understands that it's going to look different for every school. So each school needs to consider cultural responsiveness. Each school needs to consider how do we build community. And it's very, very clear how those procedures, events, etc., are sort of backwards aligned to
Absolutely.
the main framework. Yeah, I love this.
Exactly. And I think, as schools are able to identify what are their, systemic areas of growth and strengths that they have, that we also want to provide opportunities for schools to be able to exchange those ideas with one another. And so if I, and for schools to get support with any of these areas. So if we're identifying that, we really need some professional development on what types of routines and procedures, what might that look like for our school, or community building, as you mentioned, and cultural responsiveness. That's going to be from school to school. We are happy to provide as much or as little professional development as is needed at the school to help facilitate those conversations and for that process to be able to just develop naturally within the schools. But we also want to recognize that there are some amazing systems in place in our schools, and so not everyone is going to need the same support with all of these areas. So yeah, it's really, like you mentioned, a backwards planning process.